So we're in this really beautiful theme currently called Living with Kindness. Kindness burning, shining, blazing forth. That's the theme. And this evening's talk is called From Love to Insight, Dying for Love. So we're at the moment in the theme, we're taking a close look at the Buddha's teaching on loving kindness. So we're looking at that in the form of the Paranita Metta Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on how we need to live to develop metta, and how the path of metta is a full and complete path to enlightenment. So we've been hearing so far that we've heard that the Paranita Metta Sutta can be seen in terms of the 5 aspects of the Triratna system of practice. So we've heard that it can be seen in terms of integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and receptivity, which underlies all of those stages. So in the theme so far, Vimaladasa talked to us about that first stage of integration. So we looked at the first part of the sutta, and we looked at living skillfully. If you know what is truly good for you, then this is how you need to live. So that was the first part. So we looked at how to integrate the necessary qualities for spiritual development, becoming capable, honest, gently spoken, aware of other people, happy and calm, the qualities that we really need. And then Vedanya spoke to us about the stage of positive emotion. So transforming our emotions in meditation. So in the Metta Bhavana practice, cultivating metta by working directly on the mind in meditation in the Metta Bhavana practice, and developing a wish for all living beings to be happy in their heart of hearts. And then we had our wonderful personal talks from Emma and Sangajiva and Preti about how they practice the Metta Bhavana, clearly with dedication over many years, and we can just really see that working in our lovely friends. So then we heard more about positive emotion from Sangha Gita with that beautiful talk on the divine abodes, the Brahma Viharas, which are like living in heaven right here and now. Okay, so we've had integration and we've had positive emotion. And tonight we're moving on to the stage of spiritual death or spiritual insight. Those terms are interchangeable, spiritual death, spiritual insight. So we're looking at the final part of the sutta tonight, which says, in this way, you will leave all wrong views far behind. You will experience the spiritual insight that is beyond words and concepts. And going completely beyond craving, you will be liberated from the wheel of samsara forever. So the Paranita Metta Sutta is telling us that the path of metta, the path of living with kindness, leads to spiritual insight, it leads to spiritual death, and it leads to enlightenment itself. So in the tradition, it's said that once insight has arisen, enlightenment is guaranteed. There's no falling back into ignorance once insight is deeply arisen. As the sutta said, you will be liberated from the wheel of samsara forever. And traditionally, there are 2 approaches in meditation. There's samatha meditation and vipassana meditation. So samatha practices are aimed at concentrating and calming the mind, and vipassana practices are aimed at developing insight through sustained reflection. So there's a traditional approach in meditation to working towards insight. Okay, so I'm going to give us an outline of this really simple method here. So here we go, bear with me. Let's just do this, it's really simple. So you start with samatha meditation, you develop a deeply concentrated, profoundly, blissfully calm, open and receptive mind. Enter seamlessly into the dhyanas, higher states of consciousness. Blissfully course up and down the dhyanas, the higher formless dhyanas for a bit. Settle and dwell in one of the lower dhyanas. There you do the vipassana, directed, sustained reflection. using your profoundly calm and concentrated mind. And then you reflect on the true nature of existence and you gain direct knowledge and insight into ultimate reality. That's how you do it. Ta-da. Okay, so we'll do that. Let's crack on. It might take a bit more than the 20 minutes it will do after the tea break, but you never know. You never know. We might do it. Okay, so in short, samatha is the calming, and then vipassana is the reflecting. And more seriously, it's sometimes said, especially in the Theravadan tradition, that metta practice and the Brahma Viharas are pure samatha practices, and they cannot take you very far along the path. That you need a more targeted vipassana practice to gain insight. However, this sutta is telling us otherwise. It's telling us, and it's the words of the Buddha directly, tell us here that the path of metta itself can take us all the way to enlightenment. It can liberate us from the wheel of samsara forever. Okay, so to understand this, firstly, what is insight? What is spiritual death? What are we talking about? So this is transcendental wisdom. This means seeing reality as it is. It's the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice. It's to see more with the heart and mind of a Buddha. Direct knowledge of things as they really are, the true nature of existence, ultimate reality, the beyond. This is what insight and spiritual death is referring to, is pointing towards. So insight means profoundly and directly realizing the truth, actually, of praticca samutpada, which is the Buddha's central teaching. It's conditioned co-production, that all things are conditioned and all things are impermanent. That's what this is about. So this insight means realizing that there's no separate, independent, fixed things anywhere to be found, not in the way that we usually assume. Everything is conditioned, everything is dependently arising. So crucially here in this context, this means that there's no fixed and separate self, there's no fixed and separate me. And that's the teaching of an Atman. So we saw that on the beginner's course and then the intermediate course, one of the lectures. So insight, spiritual death, is directly realizing the truth of an Atman, that there is, in fact, no fixed, separate self. It's a realization of egolessness. So as the sutta says, we're leaving all wrong views far behind. We're leaving behind our wrong view of having a fixed and separate self. So that's what this is referring to. So spiritual death, seeing through and being liberated from the shackles of that sense of a separateness, a separate fixed self. How can the path of kindness and love, metta, how can that bring about that realization? So the sutta is saying that living with kindness will bring about that insight into reality. And I must admit, when I was writing this talk, I thought, will it though? Really? Will it though? Just kindness? I was like, I've really had to reflect on this. And I thought, well, the Buddha said it did, so I guess that'll be a yes, really. I think it will. So, yeah, all that aside, really. Insight, it's the way I've been thinking about it in formulating what I'm going to say is that it's a very different state of being. It's very different from our usual way of seeing things is dualistic, isn't it? I've got me here, separate to everything else out there and everybody else out there. So insight is seeing with a completely different mode or perspective to that. Instead of this me having a searchlight of awareness and looking out, it's an expansive experience of being without identifying with the self at the center of that experience and without feeling separation in that way. And so, of course, metta, love in its very highest spiritual sense, is expansive. It is a state of no separateness. Love is a state of no separateness. The highest, unlimited, unbounded spiritual state of metta is a state of no separation, no separateness. So I thought, yeah, I figure metta in its very highest form, metta that is burning, shining and blazing forth, that is an aspect of insight in that way of absolute connection. So the path of metta, it takes a slightly different approach. It takes the approach of directly transforming our emotional responses. It develops our love and our kindness to how they would be if we did have insight into no self. If we really realised that, that would how we naturally would emotionally be. So through developing love and connection, compassion and care for others, it reduces our emotional sense of separation and the tendency for our awareness and consciousness to just centre on the self. So we can see in that way that taken to its ultimate, metta can take us all the way to enlightenment and insight. Okay, so Bhante Sangha, the founder of our movement, he definitely recommended this positive, expansive approach to insight for us, particularly in the modern West. So sometimes in the modern West, we can struggle with self-worth. We can struggle with the first stage of the metta bhavana, actually, the self-metta. So practices, insight practice that are aimed at annihilating the sense of self directly might not necessarily be the most healthy or effective practice for us. And Sangha also notes that we tend to be quite intellectual. So rather than emotionally expansive and connected, we tend to prefer to think about the doctrines in a metaphysical way. We want to think about it. So rather than using the teachings to transform our emotions and drives and deepen our connection to others, we prefer to sort of reflect in quite an intellectual way. It's just part of our life training, I think. And so we of course, we can have difficulty with spiritual death, with the idea of spiritual death. Maybe we fear changing so completely. Or maybe we try and appropriate spiritual death. Maybe we want to stay me, but the same me with insight. So we want to add it on to me. So we want the same me with insight. And of course, insight isn't about staying me. It's about letting go of me. So it can be a bit of a kind of catch-22 conundrum type situation, really. So the path of metta can be really helpful in getting around all that. We can expand and grow the sense of self rather than trying to dismantle it or get rid of anything. So Bhante, in his book, Living with Kindness, which the series is based on, says that the path of metta is a path of deepening our emotional involvement with the teaching of no self. He says that in our current unenlightened state, we're centered around the sense of self. And developing metta can be like launching a satellite. So a satellite has a gravitational pull towards the Earth. And rather than just flying out freely, indefinitely, it settles into an orbit around the Earth. It's pulled back towards the Earth and it settles into an orbit around the Earth. And so similarly, our metta orbits the self. It's really hard for it to fully break away. So even our really kindest actions can be tinged with a sense of self-referencing about me, am I all right, what's in it for me, kind of ideas. And he points out that the fixed and separate self, well, it's only an illusion anyway. It's not really how things are. And it can be helpful for us to think about expanding that sense of self that we do have in an outward movement to include other people. So we can try to expand our scope to include more awareness and more concern for the well-being of others and keep doing that indefinitely until the self is universalized and unlimited. And that is another way of realizing spiritual death and insight, by expansion rather than getting rid of anything. And he says if we do that very expansive metta practice, that will lead to insight, not just an intellectual understanding, but as a fully lived out knowledge, a fully developed positivity. He says, realizing a Natman, egolessness, isn't an intellectual exercise. Egolessness simply means being truly and deeply unselfish. It's a change in attitude and behaviors. So he says that Quite challengingly, I think, if we find it difficult to realise the ultimate emptiness of the self, the solution is to try to be a little less selfish. So it can be done on a very emotional level. Okay, so insight, spiritual death, there's a story, a myth to illustrate this process. It's the story of how the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara came into being. Oh yeah, we still have the image here, the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. So it's the story, the myth behind this being. So Avalokiteshvara is the archetypal bodhisattva of compassion. And he's the symbol of our order. And apparently he used to have the usual number of arms and the usual number of heads. And out of his intense love for all beings, he vowed to save them all, each and every one of them. He vowed to save all beings from their states of suffering. So he undertook that if he ever doubted this commitment, let his head be shattered into pieces. I'd have just said, I'll just have a bit of a break, make me a cuppa, and then I'll try again. But he was really, really determined, really determined. So he meditated for eons, strongly developing compassion for all beings whatsoever. But when he looked up, he saw that there were still many, many suffering beings in the world, and he thought, oh no, I just can't do it. And his head shattered into pieces. I know, and he cried out in anguish and despair, but he was saved immediately by Amitabha, the Buddha of unlimited love. And Amitabha put him back together with 11 heads and with 1,000 arms so that he was even more equipped to act for the benefit of all beings whatsoever. So that's good. Happy ending. It's fine, it's fine. This is going to make me cry, that story. Okay, so this myth, it's a metaphor, isn't it, for spiritual death? And it can be like that. It can be completely shattering. Spiritual death, insight can be completely shattering. We can be totally taken apart and come back together in a completely different way. Or more usually, it can be very gradual over a very long time of practice. And I think as well, we can also have real experiences of genuine insight into no self. And then we can lose sight of them. At the time, it seems as though we have realised and now know something that we will just never forget. But unless we change how we live and how we act to reflect what we know, it can become a memory. It can just become a distant memory. We've got to allow our little insights to really transform us quite deeply on a really deep level. So, for example, we might go on retreat and we really see and know something. We feel like we've had a really deep and profound realization. And we have, of course. We've definitely seen something. We've definitely learned something of the truth. Of course we have. But then we come home and we're busy and we're stressed and we might go out to a party with some old friends. We might fall into a few old habits. And before we know it, we're going, what was that thing? What was that thing that I knew about? It can sort of be dissipated away. So it's really important to cherish and cultivate our little insights that we have, to dwell on them and to let them really change us. Because insight, it's a change in perspective, it's a change of viewpoint, and it needs to be then accompanied by a change in our emotional responses and our actions for it to really take root. As Sangha Night says, we have to find an emotional equivalent for our intellectual understandings. So we need to deepen what we've realised. We need to recall and act from that knowledge, even when we forget a bit and even when we don't fully have access to the insight. So maybe our Sangha friends can help us. I'm really glad Jordana's here this evening. One of my little examples is our spiritual friends can remind us. So in our Mitra group, a long time ago, we had lots of these little symbolic reminders of little insights that we'd had. For example, we had the cup moment where a friend saw the whole world in a coffee cup. And it was just like, I think that was the thing. And we'd just go, remember your cup moment. Not the thing, that wasn't the thing. I've forgotten it. Or the toast moment when one of us saw that really resisting craving by not overeating this delicious piece of buttered toast would lead to beautiful states of ease and perfection. So we were like, the toast moment, don't forget. So when we just really want to distract ourselves with toast, or the cup's just the cup again, maybe our friends can kind of remind us and go, don't forget your cup thing. I've forgotten your cup thing, I'm really sorry. So actually everybody here has had experiences of insights. That's why we're here. It's why we practice, and it's why we keep turning up. We need to remember that. We need to remember the Vision Week on the intro course when we went over why are we doing this? What do we know? And we can try and take time to recall our own vision and maybe keep a journal, talk to our friends about it, and really try and deepen what we really know. Okay, so the Metta Bhavana as a path to insight. Sangha in the book Living with Kindness, he describes a slightly different, interesting approach to the Metta Bhavana practice, to the Metta Bhavana meditation. And I think this approach encourages these little insights that we might have, because the Metta Bhavana can be a real insight practice. We can really start to see through some of our habitual emotional responses and our really entrenched habits and attitudes and viewpoints. We can really start to see it. So this approach in Living with Kindness is interesting. The approach is to cultivate an experience of metta in whatever way we can, however we can do that, and develop the ability to maintain that state of metta undisturbed as we bring to mind the people in the stages of the Metta Bhavana. Okay, so of course that's a very high bar. It's a really advanced practice. Sounds simple, but it's not. For metta to remain undisturbed, that would imply a really high level of insight. It would be a state that we would be in a state in which our personally conditioned likes and dislikes, our hopes and our fears, our anxieties, do not disturb the state of metta. Okay, so we would be experiencing egolessness in that sense. We would be experiencing whatever and whoever came into awareness without grasping it, without pushing it away. And without that craving, there would be no dukkha. As it says in the sutta, we would have gone completely beyond craving. So it's a very high level of practice and insight. And actually, Bhante says in the book that only a Buddha or Bodhisattva could fully do that. But we can take our steps towards it, can't we? So starting where we are now, and we can be inspired by the knowledge that if we just keep doing this, if we just keep trying to maintain metta, given the face of the hurly-burly of life, we will eventually become enlightened. That's what this sutra is saying. So we start where we are, we try to include others in our awareness, and we try and maintain some metta with less aversion and less craving, and that is the Metta Bhavana practice, isn't it? Developing metta, cultivating metta. I really like this approach because if I'm trying to cultivate metta and then I bring people to mind, it can be really surprising what happens to the metta, to this kind of, I can have this real internal reaction. And that then gives me information. It shows me my blind spots. It brings things into awareness that were quite buried before that I thought were okay. So I might be experiencing metta and I bring someone to mind and I think it's all fine, but then suddenly something kicks off. My body's going into stress or fear and thoughts will start up and I get lost in that for a while. And then I can go, oh, hang on, what is going on? What's going on here? I thought this was fine. What's happened to all the metta? Where's it gone? So if I can turn towards what's actually happening with kindness, with no judgment, no resistance, I can just have a look with kindness. There will be something lurking under there. There'll be a viewpoint or a wrong view. Something is at odds with reality, with how things really are, and I'll learn something. And that is insight practice, isn't it? Learning how things really are, as opposed to what's actually going on and what we think is going on. Okay, so the Karaniya Metta Sutta tells us how we need to live and how we need to meditate to gain insight and enlightenment. So really, how do we do that? How do we put this into practice? What can we do in our everyday life, in our everyday practice? So we need to use the law of karma to put conditions in place for metta to arise. So I've just got a few ideas of things, maybe things that we can do. So one thing that is really great if we can do it is to go on retreat, if that's available to us, to get on retreat. Because when we're on retreat, we're away from all the usual busyness of life, all the stresses and the triggers, and we've got more space to try and cultivate metta, and we've got more space to try and notice and reflect on our usual attitudes and our usual responses and what's really going on. We've got the space to look at that. And another quite simple thing we could do is maybe we could memorize some of the Paranita Metta Sutta that we're looking at. Or maybe just a couple of lines of it that really resonate with you, and we can reflect on that in our daily life, in our everyday dealings, especially when we're in some difficulty, emotional difficulty. It can really help to just really bring the Dharma in. So maybe we can memorize some lines of the sutta. And we can work quite directly to cultivate emotional positivity, maybe with a regular gratitude practice, or maybe by rejoicing in the qualities of our friends. We do that quite a lot at the centre. And as well, really important, spending time in the Sangha, because then we're putting ourselves in conditions where we're around emotionally positive and skillful people. So that's really, really beneficial. And as well, spending some time in solitude, that can really help, maybe in nature. Just taking some time to stop and pause, reflect and dwell on our experience. All these things create conditions for a heart mind of metta to develop, to arise. Okay, and the main thing we can do is to practice the metta bhavana. And so maybe perhaps read Living with Kindness, the relevant bit, and try the approaches in there. It's a really, really excellent book. So one little example of something that I do at the moment in my life is like a little bit of reflection on metta when I'm especially tired or when I'm stressed. So like when things are not going my way and I'm not happy about it. So for me, that's especially if I'm really overtired and I've still got things to do for other people usually. So I might have had a long day and I've still got loads of driving to do, or I've got chores to do. I can really get into resentment. I don't want to do it. I can feel quite overwhelmed when I'm tired. And I can start thinking, oh, it's really unfair that I've got to do all these things. It's all down to me. And I can just start thinking, oh, I just can't do it, and then start complaining. So I can reflect, well, all this resentment in my mind, all this that's going on, instead of trying to push it away or even like feeling guilty about feeling like that, or maybe getting myself really behind it and getting more and more and more resentful and angry, I can go, well, all these things, all these thoughts, all these feelings, all of this, it's all arising out of conditions. So of course I feel like this, the conditions are there and this is going to happen. It makes absolute sense. It's just arising out of conditions. And sometimes I can like turn it around with metta and go, so actually in and of itself, it's completely perfect. It's just arising out of the conditions in a perfect way. It's an expression of reality. It's perfect. It's fine. And if I can love it, if I can really love it in that way, just love it, then it changes. Instead of the resistance and the resentment, there's some ease and some release. And of course, you can't just love it to make it go away. You've got to kind of really love it. It's like you've got to really mean it. And that's a form of metta practice, isn't it? Just trying to love whatever's arising without resisting or judging. And it's really hard to do, but it's worth trying. And that's the metta bhavana, isn't it? So we do the metta bhavana, we do it in our own way, and we put helpful conditions in place for metta to arise. And we're setting up conditions for moments of seeing things differently, seeing little insights. Okay, so just to finish, the main thing I really want to say is the main thing to do is the metta bhavana meditation. And I think it's really important to say this as well. From the perspective as metta as a path to insight, doing the metta bhavana doesn't have to feel good. It doesn't have to feel nice, it doesn't have to feel good, and it doesn't have to be easy. Okay? And I want to say two things about that, two very positive, beneficial things that are just true. Okay? They're just true, and it doesn't matter how the meditation goes, okay? So it doesn't matter. Obviously, it's better if we're not, but if you are filled with hatred and craving the whole way through the meditation, even if it feels really difficult and really unpleasant, these two things are still true, and they're still really good reasons for doing it. Okay, so firstly, just sitting down to do the metta bhavana means you already have some insight, some level of insight, because you understand conditionality and you understand karma. You understand praticca samuppada. You know that you can change, and that's why you're doing it. So you already have some level of insight into the Buddha's very central teaching of conditioned co-production. And the more you do the practice, the more change you will see and the deeper that insight will go. So that in itself is worth doing, whether it's pleasant or not. And secondly, the other good reason, just doing the metta bhavana, again, no matter how that goes, no matter whether you think it's gone well or not, just doing the metta bhavana, just deciding to try and change your emotional responses, trying to create positive emotions towards other people, that action in and of itself is of great kindness. So if you've got difficulty with a person, you could be going around letting the tyres down or whatever, couldn't you? Doing whatever. But instead, you're doing the kindest thing you can and you're cultivating metta. So just the very act of sitting down to cultivate metta, you've already done it. You've already cultivated metta. You've already done it. You've won. As soon as you sit on the cushion, you've done it. You've done the metta bhavana, even if you don't feel as though it's going well. So however you think it's going, even if it doesn't feel good, and often it will feel good and be very pleasant, very easy, most of all, it's worth just doing it and having confidence that in and of itself, it is an insight practice and it creates strongly positive karmic effects, even if it doesn't feel good. Okay, so I'll just end with a quote from Sangha about metta. So Sangha says, metta has the taste of freedom. If you are able to act out of metta, if you treat others just as you treat yourself, you are acting as if the distinction you unthinkingly create in your mind between yourself and others simply did not exist. In doing so, you free yourself from the power of the illusion of a separate self. This is insight, and though you might not experience it in a cognitive way, the fact that you have developed metta, the emotional equivalent of insight, means that you have developed insight nonetheless. Thank you.